Welcome everybody online and those special people in the room at the Northern Institute to our Northern Institute PPP, People Policy Place Seminar for this week. My name is Andrew Taylor. I work with the Demography and Growth Planning team at the Northern Institute. I'd firstly like to acknowledge and recognise that David is speaking from lands of the traditional owners of the Darwin region, the Larrakia people, and I would like to acknowledge and recognise their elders, past, present and future. A very warm welcome. I'd like to quickly thank Bindi at the Northern Institute and the support team for setting this up. Now, the way this will work today is that with some joy, David and I are the only people that can speak in this webinar. The rest of you will be forced to speak to us and ask questions at the end using the question and answer box, which I hope you can all see. So with that in mind, if you would like to communicate with myself as the moderator of the session, if there's any sound issues or anything else that's not working for you, please just do a Q&A or a comment in the other chat box, and I'm keeping an eye on both of those. So today's talk will go for approximately 30 minutes. I'd just like to recognise David's long-standing relationship and cooperation in research with the Northern Institute, which we realised the other day, David, stretches out over 7 or 8 or 10 years now, and began with some a research cooperation, an MOU with David's Institute in Hungary, the Geographical Institute. At the Academy of Sciences, and we've been lucky to progress a number of joint research projects and outputs. And David's now a valuable part of our demography and growth planning team, so it's great to have him on board. In Darwin, today David's going to be speaking about, well, to say it's a topical issue would be obviously a gross understatement, but David's taking a bit of a different look at COVID from a vulnerability perspective. And I've been partly involved in some of this work with David and Sigurd. I hope that you do find it interesting. I will step aside now and turn my camera off, and let's extend a warm virtual welcome to David and his presentation, A Spatial Interpretation of Australia's COVID Vulnerability. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for the very kind introduction. So our today's talk will be about social vulnerability related to the COVID-19 pandemic disaster. So that's already highlighted that our approach is a social science approach within demography and the disaster studies or disaster researches. And the topic is, that's very important to emphasize, about social vulnerability and not about medical or health vulnerability. So we are taking a special approach on that social vulnerability with a special emphasis on sparsely populated areas like the Northern Territory itself. It's important to focus on that, first of all, because sparsely populated areas are characterized by a larger share of indigenous population within our total population, or like a larger share of fly-in, fly-out labor force, which are, both of them are impacted or can be impacted by the circumstances generated of that pandemic disaster. And even the starting pictures, photos that I put here up, it's reflecting the demographic and geographic diversity of Australia, ranging from Sydney CBD to the very sparsely populated Northern Territory. So if we are thinking about the current pandemic disaster, it's very often emphasized that the starting point was that wet market in Wuhan, or generally the wet markets, are representing a threat to the people. I want to take a slightly different approach from that. So first of all, if we look at the the literature on viruses and the biological background, we can find out that virus transmissions will be more frequent because of number of reasons in the future. So first of all, because of the effect of habitat destruction, because of the climate change, and particularly because of increase of population living in vulnerable areas. You can just think about crowded urban spaces, particularly in developing countries, you know, like slums or like people where they don't have really access to, for example, medical services. So that's why we want to have look at that current pandemic disaster through the view of the school of social vulnerability, which in our understanding, providing an alternative view of understanding what's happening in our society. If we look at in a broader context on the coronavirus pandemic disaster, there are certain points we can highlight and discuss. So there is also a role in the current disaster, the weakening international institutional systems, particularly focusing on WHO. There is also when the Asian wet markets, or particularly Chinese wet markets, were blamed, or the consumption of exotic animals. There were an angle of post-colonialism, and as well, more strikingly, there is a strong geopolitics in that issue. There is also an issue with budget cuts in healthcare system in some states and countries of the world. And of course, there is social vulnerability in that story as well. And also there is a story about government policies which fail to address the above challenges. But our today's talk is focusing exclusively on social vulnerabilities. So first of all, I would like to talk a little bit about the conceptual background of social vulnerability in disaster sciences, and then going on the current pandemic disaster and the results of our research later on. So if we look at the paradigm shifts in disaster studies probably in the last century, we can see that there was a continuous shifting to look at disasters as poorly embedded in nature towards later on poorly embedded into the society, so exclusively as a social phenomenon. You know, earlier, before the establishment of that specific disaster study field, disasters were often understood as a kind of act of God, as a very random and unpredictable event. Later on, it was understood as a kind of interplay between nature and society. And more recently, it's viewed exclusively and just particularly embedded into the society. So here I also cited one of the main names, some of the main names in disaster science. So it's already broadly acknowledged that disaster is influenced by humans. Also, it's debated that can we speak at all about natural disasters, or are these disasters really a natural or something else? You know, it's because even nature can be allocated unevenly through social processes, which puts people in a vulnerable position. But of course, there are also criticisms on that unnaturalizing the disaster, still emphasizing that disasters and nature can influence on human society. Just think about the current COVID pandemic, how that change your everyday life and will change probably on a long run. So if I want to simply summarize up all these talks, then I have to cite here McIntyre, who actually thought that there is two main schools in disaster studies or in disaster science. So one is the holistic school, which understand disaster as a kind of extreme event, non-routine event, out of or normal functioning, and looking disaster in that way, while the other, the social vulnerability school, which I am going to focus from now on, is looking at disaster as it's embedded in the normal functioning of the society and it's rooted in social inequalities. So it's very important to emphasize that the question is not about the disaster itself, but about our social vulnerability. So to translate it to the current COVID pandemic disaster, the question is not on the virus transmission or the health consequences, but how the vulnerabilities in our society expose people to different levels of effect of the disaster. So social systems generate conditions that could place people in different levels of risk from the same, very same hazard event. So we should really ask that, is this really once in a century disaster, or it's something else? To answer that question, I would like to go to the next step, which focusing on the social vulnerability in the current pandemic disaster. So, you know, science is in a difficult situation now because all our results have to go through a peer review, it has to be discussed. So we are much slower to provide results than, for example, stories or topics highlighted by the news, by the media. So the first studies on social vulnerabilities related to the current pandemic disaster started to be available from maybe May of this year, but already we can find quite some studies focusing particularly on social vulnerabilities. And here I summarized up some main points, what we can already see. So there are plenty of studies coming from the US because they were very hard hit by the disaster, and they highlight that African American communities are more vulnerable than others. Also, scientific results highlight that social inequalities playing a big role in that who is affected by the disaster. Of course, aging and age care system is a hot topic, and there is a lot of discussion in science as well. As well, migrant workers who can often become the forgotten group within the society, and of course displaced people who can be vulnerable, you know, in refugee camps, refugee centers, without accessing normal health or food or conditions. So these are the main groups highlighted as a highly vulnerable groups in the literature. So based on that, we started to focus on 4 vulnerable groups in Australia. So where they are living, what is their distribution. So these 4 groups are, first of all, the elderly people, population above 60 years old. Then there were 2 minority groups we focused especially. These are the Indigenous Australians and the non-citizens. The non-citizens are also vulnerable in that situation because they are often lack of networks and information and economic aid. And the last one are people on move who are migrating. They are mostly affected by the lockdown efforts as to fight the virus. So here I want to stop for a minute about and talk a little bit about the spatial diversity of Australia and why we had to take a different approach. So ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, provide spatial or geographic data based on the Australian statistical geographic standards. which provide data on different levels that's based on the population size from SA2 to SA4 level. So SA2 are the most detailed level where we can get estimated residence population data. But it's the problem with that ASGS system that it's focusing on a quite, so it should be more equal the population distribution so between units, and it's not really emphasizing the size difference of that unit. So what we get at the end, that in inner urban areas, we see a high spatial detailedness, while in sparsely populated areas, the picture is not that detailed geographically. So to overcome this problem and to better visualize the spatial distribution of vulnerable groups and to have a better performing analysis later on, we decided to adjust that SA2 level. So basically we merge those SA2 units which are located in greater capital cities areas or in a more densely populated areas. So, and as a result, we get less than 200 such units which we used in the further analysis. So here are coming the 4 vulnerable groups we were focusing on. First of all, the elderly people, population above 60 years old. We can see that these people are mostly have a higher share in the units, within units where the population density is relatively higher and the area is relatively less remote. They have, of course, a high absolute number in greater capital city areas. The second group are the indigenous people. And here we can see that even though they have an absolute high number in greater capital cities, but within the local populations, they have a much higher share in remote and sparsely populated areas. So they have a slightly different population distribution, and the 2 slides is almost each other's complementary if you see that. So there is an old Australia and there is an indigenous Australia in this camps. The third group are the non-citizens. So their distribution is similar to the indigenous people. So they have a high absolute number in greater capital cities, but they also have a high share within local population in some of the sparsely populated regions or jurisdictions. So particularly in Pilbara and some other areas like Mount Isa, or here like in South Australia, where the mining sector is very significant, so we can see the higher share of them. And finally, here is the churn rate, people on move. This reflects the total migration turnover in relation to the total population in each of the units. So we can see that sparsely populated areas particularly have a high churn rate, which if there is a lockdown effort or like the borders are closed, these sparsely populated regions are particularly vulnerable. So, but we wanted to provide a more complex understanding of vulnerabilities, and we look at the literature, what kind of approaches scientists or earlier studies had before to understand vulnerability when it's about the COVID-19 pandemic. When we look at the literature, which has, as I would like to repeat again, that we have seen published studies only since April, May this year, because science is always slower to provide results and evidence. But within this literature, we have seen 2 main ways of understanding social vulnerability to the COVID-19 pandemic disaster. So one approach was about the risk prediction, where we don't really see yet the case numbers, but we try to identify the vulnerable areas and groups, and we try to create, based on the demographic, social and economic data what we have already from the past, we try to create a composite index or indices, also using principal component analysis or some typologies to understand which are the vulnerable areas. The second approach, that can happen only in a frame as a kind of post-event analysis when there are a high number of cases, to see what was in the past, the interplay between vulnerability and the actual number of cases. So for this purpose, mostly correlation or regression or like hotspot analysis can be used. Of course, if we look at the number of studies, we see that the risk prediction is pretty much dominating the literature. That's because we needed, so science needs some time to find out results. And at the first wave, in many places, at the beginning, we just wanted to know which are the potential vulnerable areas. So there were plenty of studies to estimate that vulnerability. Later on, when the case numbers started to grow, some studies have been already published about the connection between social vulnerability and the actual cases. And as a last group, there are already a few number of studies. So here is only I listed two, which focusing on economic consequences. That's not related directly to the pandemic or the health problem, but that related to the lockdown efforts in some countries. So these examples are taken from all over the world, from the US, from developing countries and other places as well. So based on the two approaches, risk prediction or to understand how the vulnerability interplayed with the case numbers, we had to use the risk prediction approach because during the first wave of the pandemic in Australia, so that's before the Victorian outbreak, there was a very small number of cases which were very random, and the most important that there were no really community transmissions. So social vulnerabilities are covered up mainly when community transmissions are happening. So in order to understand vulnerability, we use principal component analysis, which I'm going to talk now about how it looks like. So there were 22 indicators available by ABS. This is data by region based on estimated residence population from the past, which we were thinking that they are potentially suitable for a principal component analysis, because in one way or the other, they related to social vulnerabilities. Then we put these indices into the box of principal component analysis, and we try to get principal components. These are a kind of complex dimensions of vulnerability, and we tried various iterations to extract the best fit model, which finally based on 12 indicators and resulted in two main principal components or factors. The first one, the stronger one, reflects the so-called demographic vulnerability. It's mostly related to indigenous people, to elderly people, also to certain small businesses. and also to unemployment. And the second dimension is related exclusively to, we call it economic vulnerabilities as a result of the lockdown efforts. So these are share of people living less than $500 per week, or what is the income of average income earners, or what is the share in employment, the mining and the construction sector. So that's the second we understood as fully an economic dimension. And the two components basically explain 72% of the initial variance represented by that 12 indicators. Then we put the results on a map. So first, the first dimension, the more stronger the demographic vulnerability, we can see on that map. And I want to emphasize here that both ends of the scale, so extreme low and extreme high values, are also representing vulnerabilities. This is a clear distinction between indigenous and old Australia. So indigenous groups are also vulnerable in a way. We can see them mostly here in the Northern Territory and in some parts of the outback Australia, while the high values of so the high scores, high factor scores, which related to the elderly people, they are close to greater capital city areas or a more settled area. So we can see that kind of very clear spatial distinction, this regionality within Australia. And the second dimension, the economic vulnerability, it has a different pattern in the geographic space. So here our greater capital cities has a high value, and also some remote, sparsely populated areas, mostly connected to mining sector, East Arnhem, Rhode Island, Mount Isa, here the mining area in South Australia, or Pilbara, here the gold mining. So all the areas where the economy is running well, and if there is a lockdown effort, they have a lot of, they can lose a lot of things, you know, due to economic crisis. So if we look at the map, particularly Western Australia is very vulnerable in that aspect, and that already highlights why they are so keen on keeping their border closed, because if they are facing with the lockdown, they are really vulnerable in terms of economy. But then we went further with our analysis and we run the same principal component analysis using the original geography, because we want to see how the original SA2 level with a much higher case, much higher unit numbers, how it performs. But it was our feeling that we couldn't really extract that clearly these two dimensions, and this is particularly because in the original SA2, intra-urban dimensions and the regionality is mixed together, and it's not really allow us to extract the two dimensions which we understood as a key point. So later on we try to narrow down and focusing more on the sparsely populated areas and to see what kind of results we can extract from the principal component analysis. But in any case, we have seen that there are something like economic dimension if we going more focused on a more sparse area, so to regional Australia and to remote and sparsely populated area. So there are always an economic dimension. There is always a population dimension. when taking all the SA2s, that's basically related to the overseas population. When we go more remotely, that's more related to the indigenous population. But only in a when we take only those areas where the population density is less than 5 people per square kilometer, we can see only that that phenomenon became a two-dimensional, so economy and demography dimension. So that's kind of a feedback to or adjusted geography that it's well reflecting sparsely populated areas, but in the same time we don't lose any area, so we can include all Australia in that model. And that table also shows us how vulnerability, the understanding of vulnerability shifted through if we do different zoning or different geography, if we modifying the study area. So it's, as a main conclusion, it shows that the geography is playing a very important role in understanding of vulnerability, and the policies should reflect that kind of geographic diversity as well. So to get to the main conclusions at the end, so we extracted two composite indices which showed the two-dimensionality in our understanding the current pandemic disaster, the demographic and the economic dimension, and that has demographic and economic dimensions are the two key elements in the COVID policy debates as well in Australia. But I also thought that vulnerabilities are also scale and place or zoning sensitive. And so geography plays a role in that. It's not only depend on health and social status exclusively. One limitation I have to highlight here at the end, that principal component analysis is also influenced by the researchers' decisions. So what kind of indexes, what kind of variables we select for the indicators, and how we push that model, so it's influenced by our view. But of course, in this aspect, it was our purpose to highlight that two-dimensionality of the vulnerability in Australia. And as a very concluding sentence, I would like to highlight that is why geography and border closings matter so strongly in the current COVID pandemic policy debates in Australia. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope my presentation helped you to understand that we should departure or view purely from the biological aspects of that disaster, and within Australia we have to look at into our society, how is it looks like, and how is this reflected through the geographic diversity of the country. So thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you, David. There are claps coming through the airwaves, and indeed well-deserved claps. So thank you for your interesting presentation. What we'll do now is have some question time, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
And I do have a question ready to go from Georgina Gartland. I'm going to try and summarize it because it's a little bit long. Apologies, Georgina, but if I don't quite get this right. But Georgina is commenting about the vulnerability of remote living Indigenous Territorians, and in particular in relation to health services, safe water supplies, housing, social housing, and culturally relevant remote health in particular. Now, the question from Georgina is, well, a statement is that if COVID reaches these communities, these services will be devastated, and she's wondering if you have any comment on these aspects of the current pandemic.
Yes, of course. So the second, the first dimension, the demographic dimension, clearly represented that kind of two end of the scale, the indigenous vulnerability and the aged vulnerability within one dimension. So of course, I totally agree with the comment that indigenous communities are particularly vulnerable because of their remoteness, because of their limited access to health service or clean water, because of their housing conditions that more generations may live in one apartment. And that's the main message of our study, that is why social vulnerabilities have to be taken seriously, because that helps us to cope with that disaster, but not only that disaster, other disasters as well. So why I really like that social vulnerability approach, because it not only provides a solution or a view to the current pandemic, but it provides a view throughout other kind of disasters. And that's why it should be taken more seriously into consideration. Yeah, so.
Thank you very much, David. Georgina, please type up something if you have anything to add to that conversation after David's answer. I might ask something, David, just extending what you were just talking about in terms of recognising that social vulnerabilities should be coming into the discussion around the evolution and perhaps how we manage the pandemic. What advice would you give to politicians to sort of further that? You know, how can understanding of social vulnerabilities be used hand in hand with efforts to stop the spread of the pandemic? Just wondering if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, so I have a couple of talks related to that. First of all, you know, the disaster is already here, so probably understanding social vulnerabilities that for future waves or future disasters can help us. I mean, to change social vulnerabilities, that's possible only in a very long time, and that needs a lot of efforts. But if we highlight these vulnerabilities, that can be addressed, and it makes countries and people less vulnerable in the future, if these are clear. Related to the current pandemic, I think what is clearly visible in a way from the result, that why different states and territories have a different policy approach on border closures or border opening. And that's related to the geographic diversity and demographic diversity of Australia. And I think that should be considered in the policy discussions as well. And any kind of opening up should be very carefully designed, considering that kind of geographic diversity.
Thank you very much, David, for your answer. We do have another question from Chips McNulty. Chips, welcome to our Northern Institute seminar. Chips's question is, unless I missed it, the other issue that might determine vulnerability is pre-existing morbidities that are also reflected in Indigenous and aged communities, not to mention rural communities which have higher rates of these conditions than metro areas. So in a sense, geography also reflects these determinants. It would also be interesting to map the biosecurity areas that the federal government has enforced. Any comments there? Did you hear the question okay, David?
Yes. So I try to reflect. So as I understand, it's also related to mobilities. So of course, mobility was one of the main aspects of our research.
David, I'll interrupt. Yeah. I'm sorry. Morbidities, so causes of
morbidity.
Death.
Sorry. Sorry. Yeah. So the main problem with the morbidity that can be emphasized through the other approach. So there were the two approaches on understanding social vulnerability, and our approach is a kind of estimation of the vulnerabilities before actually the disaster happens. Of course, the other approach should be part of that research, but thanks God, in Australia, except Victoria, the case numbers were very low to conduct that kind of studies. But as I show in the literature, other countries, particularly in the US, there has been a lot of study on understanding how the morbidities are influenced. The actual morbidities are influenced by the social vulnerabilities. So that's the other main approach of the disaster.
Okay, thank you. And then just a comment was from Chips about the federal government biosecurity area. So you might take that away and have a think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure about the biosecurity areas. I mean, if it's related to the border closing, I think so. In this way, we should understand that if certain states and territories, as I mentioned, have a different approach on opening up or closing down their borders, that's influenced by the geographic and demographic diversity on their territory.
Yes, I can't get my camera back on. I think Chips was talking about a different set of biosecurity areas. I'm sorry, Chips, I'm not familiar, but we'll take that comment on board and have a look at how we might fit it into the research. We have a question from Ram for Muri now. Hi, Ram. Ram's question is, the disaster of the COVID crisis is not a fixed event in terms of vulnerability. Vulnerability is highly interdependent on the two types you have identified. How do you incorporate the interdependent and interactive vulnerabilities?
So if I understood the question correctly, so that the vulnerabilities are changing through the disaster, how the disaster is developing. Of course, there are changing in that vulnerabilities, and of course the mapping what we have done, that is a static view based on the literature evidence what we have now, but that of course should be and can be revisited later on based on how the course of the disaster changing. I understand the question. Yeah, of course. So what I was talking here, that's social vulnerability, and of course there is a medical vulnerability as well. But medical vulnerabilities, because we are demographers and geographers, and in a way like the disaster experts, so we don't work with the medical vulnerabilities, because medical vulnerabilities are connected to the health conditions, and that's, I think it's a different story. Thank you very much also for your attention. Thank you very much.